What if I told you that the man who was supposed to be Canada's next prime minister, the politician who had a 20-point lead in the polls just months ago, not only lost the election but lost his own seat in Parliament after 20 years? Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader who was virtually guaranteed to become prime minister, suffered one of the most shocking political defeats in Canadian history. But what really happened behind the scenes? What tactical miscalculations and strategic blunders led to this historic collapse? The story I'm about to tell you reveals the dark side of modern political campaigning, the dangerous game of overconfidence, and how a man who seemed unstoppable became the architect of his own political destruction. This isn't just about one election loss. This is about how the Conservative Party's internal power struggles, questionable strategic decisions, and Pierre Poilievre's own controversial methods ultimately backfired in spectacular fashion. Before we dive into this incredible political story, make sure you smash that subscribe button and hit the like button. This is the kind of behind-the-scenes political analysis you won't find anywhere else in the mainstream media. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think about this shocking election result. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you the real stories from the corridors of power that others won't tell you about. Let's start with the most stunning revelation of all. Just 4 months ago, Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party were sitting pretty with a commanding 20-point lead in the polls. Political analysts, media pundits, and even liberal insiders were practically writing Poilievre's victory speech. The man who had built his entire political brand on attacking Justin Trudeau was finally going to get his chance to govern. But here's what nobody saw coming. The very tactics that got him to the top were about to become his downfall. The first major crack in Poilievre's seemingly impenetrable armor came from an unexpected source: his own campaign team. Behind the scenes, there were growing concerns about his media strategy. Unlike previous Conservative leaders who engaged openly with journalists, Poilievre had implemented what insiders called the control and restrict approach. He severely limited media access, handpicked friendly journalists for questions, and avoided any situation where he might face tough questioning. This wasn't just about message discipline. This was about a leader who had become so used to operating in an echo chamber that he forgot how to handle real scrutiny. What makes this even more revealing is how Poilievre's team justified this strategy internally. According to sources close to the Conservative campaign, they believed that traditional media was inherently biased against them and that controlled messaging through social media and carefully staged events would be more effective. But here's the problem with that approach. When you avoid tough questions for months, you become rusty at answering them. And when the pressure finally came, Poilievre wasn't ready. The turning point came when Donald Trump began his aggressive campaign against Canada, imposing tariffs and making annexation threats. This should have been Poilievre's moment to shine. After all, he had spent years positioning himself as the strong leader Canada needed. But instead of rising to the occasion, something strange happened. The man who had been so confident in his attacks on Trudeau suddenly seemed uncertain when faced with real international pressure. Behind the scenes, the Conservative campaign was in chaos. Trump's threats had completely upended their carefully planned messaging strategy. They had built their entire campaign around domestic issues like affordability and crime, but suddenly the election was about Canada's relationship with the United States and national sovereignty. Poilievre's team struggled to adapt, and their internal polling showed voters were starting to question whether he was really ready to stand up to Trump. But the real shocker came from the Liberal Party's internal maneuvering. When Justin Trudeau announced his resignation, most political observers expected the Liberals to go through a long, divisive leadership race that would further damage their brand. Instead, they pulled off one of the smartest political moves in recent Canadian history. They quickly rallied around Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada and Bank of England, positioning him as the experienced, competent leader who could handle the Trump crisis. What Poilievre's team didn't anticipate was how effectively Carney would neutralize their key advantages. Carney's background as a respected international banker gave him credibility on economic issues that Poilievre couldn't match. More importantly, Carney's calm, measured approach stood in stark contrast to Poilievre's more combative style. When voters were looking for stability in the face of Trump's threats, Carney's demeanor was exactly what they wanted. The the Conservative campaign's internal documents, which have since been leaked, reveal just how badly they misread the situation. They had convinced themselves that Canadians were so angry with Liberal governance that they would vote Conservative regardless of who was leading the party. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. What they failed to understand was that voter anger toward the Liberals was largely directed at Justin Trudeau personally, not at the Liberal Party as a whole. Even more damaging was Poilievre's response. To the changing political landscape, instead of adapting his message and showing the kind of statesman-like leadership that the moment demanded, he doubled down on his confrontational approach. His team believed that attack ads and aggressive rhetoric had gotten them this far, so they should stick with what worked. But what works in opposition doesn't always work when you're trying to convince voters you're ready to govern. The most revealing insight into Poilievre's mindset came from his own caucus members. Several Conservative MPs, speaking anonymously, described growing frustration with his leadership style. They painted a picture of a leader who was surrounded by yes-men and who had become increasingly isolated from dissenting voices within his own party. When experienced MPs tried to warn him about the changing political dynamics, they were either ignored or shut out of decision-making processes entirely. This internal dysfunction became particularly evident in Quebec, where the Conservative campaign completely fell apart. Despite having Carl Vallet, a respected Harper-era strategist, leading their Quebec efforts, the party failed to make any significant gains in the province. Sources within the Quebec Conservative organization described a campaign that was micromanaged from Ottawa, with local candidates given little flexibility to address regional concerns. This centralized approach, championed by Poilievre's inner circle, backfired spectacularly. But perhaps the most shocking revelation of all was how Poilievre's team handled the final weeks of the campaign. As their internal polling showed the race tightening, instead of expanding their message and reaching out to undecided voters, they retreated further into their base. They increased their focus on core Conservative voters and largely abandoned efforts to win over centrist Canadians. This was a strategic blunder of monumental proportions. The warning signs were everywhere, but Poilievre's campaign chose to ignore them. Their own polling showed that while Conservative voters were enthusiastic, they were struggling to expand beyond their traditional base. Suburban voters, particularly women, were increasingly uncomfortable with Poilievre's confrontational style. Instead of addressing these concerns, the campaign doubled down on the very tactics that were turning off swing voters. What makes this even more tragic for Conservative supporters is that this election was entirely winnable for them. The Liberal Party had been in power for nearly a decade, Trudeau had resigned in disgrace, and economic concerns were at the forefront of voters' minds. All the conditions were in place for a Conservative victory, but Poilievre's strategic miscalculations and his team's overconfidence turned a sure thing into a devastating defeat. The most damning evidence of the campaign's failures came on election night itself. As results started coming in, it became clear that not only were the Conservatives losing, but they were losing badly in areas where they should have been competitive. Poilievre's own riding of Carleton, which he had held for 20 years, was suddenly in play. The fact that he lost his own seat tells you everything you need to know about how badly the Conservative campaign misjudged the political landscape. Behind the scenes, Conservative strategists were in complete shock. They had been so confident in their victory that they hadn't even prepared for the possibility of defeat. Campaign officials described a surreal atmosphere on election night, with senior staff unable to believe what they were seeing. The man who had been measuring the drapes for 24 Sussex Drive was now facing the end of his political career. The post-election analysis revealed just how badly Poilievre's team had miscalculated the Trump factor. They had assumed that Trump's threats would make Canadians more likely to vote for a strong leader like Poilievre. Instead, voters decided they wanted someone with actual experience handling international crises. Carney's background as a central banker who had navigated the 2008 financial crisis suddenly looked a lot more appealing than Poilievre's experience as an opposition politician. What's particularly revealing is how Poilievre's previous success had blinded him to changing political realities. He had been so effective at tearing down Justin Trudeau that he never learned how to build anything positive. His entire political brand was based on opposition and criticism, but when faced with the need to present a governing vision, he came up short. Canadian voters facing genuine external threats wanted a leader who could unite the country, not divide it further. The Conservative Party's internal postmortem has been brutal. Senior party officials have admitted privately that they made fundamental errors in judgment throughout the campaign. They underestimated Mark Carney, overestimated their own support, and completely misread how Canadians would react to Trump's threats. Most damaging of all, they failed to recognize that their leader's greatest strength in opposition, his ability to attack, was also his greatest weakness when trying to convince voters he was ready to govern. The leaked campaign documents reveal that Poilievre's team knew they had problems but were unwilling to admit the extent of them. Internal memos show growing concern about his favorability ratings, particularly among women and suburban voters, but these concerns were dismissed by his inner circle. They convinced themselves that their ground game and base enthusiasm would be enough to win, ignoring clear evidence that they were losing the center of the political spectrum. Perhaps the most shocking revelation is how Poilievre's campaign handled dissent within their own ranks. Several experienced conservative operatives tried to warn the leadership about their strategic mistakes, but they were either ignored or pushed aside. The campaign had become so insular that they stopped listening to outside advice, even from their own supporters. This groupthink mentality contributed directly to their election night disaster. The impact of this defeat on the Conservative Party cannot be overstated. Poilievre's loss of his own seat has created a leadership crisis that will take years to resolve. The party is now facing the possibility of a bitter leadership race while trying to figure out how they managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. The tactical miscalculations and strategic blunders that led to this historic collapse will be studied by political scientists for generations. What makes this story even more remarkable is how it exposes the dangers of political overconfidence. Poilievre and his team had become so convinced of their own inevitability that they stopped doing the hard work of winning over voters. They assumed that anger toward the Liberals would automatically translate into support for the Conservatives, but they forgot that voters had other options. When Mark Carney presented himself as a competent alternative, enough Canadians decided to give the Liberals another chance. The final revelation in this political saga is perhaps the most telling. According to sources within the Conservative campaign, even as the results were coming in on election night, some of Poilievre's closest advisors were still convinced they would win. They had been so trapped in their own echo chamber that they couldn't see the reality of their situation until it was too late. This level of self-deception is almost unprecedented in Canadian political history. The man who was supposed to be Canada's next Prime Minister instead became a cautionary tale about the dangers of political hubris. Pierre Poilievre's journey from seeming inevitability to crushing defeat reveals everything wrong with modern political campaigning: the reliance on echo chambers, the avoidance of real scrutiny, and the dangerous assumption that past success guarantees future victory. His story serves as a reminder that in politics, as in life, overconfidence can be the most dangerous enemy of all.